The Predator State is the name of the book. James K. Galbraith, an economist and professor of government and public affairs at the University of Texas, is the author. Professor Galbraith, what do you mean by the predator state? Who are the predators?
The predators are those who are attempting to take advantage of the programs that were created for the benefit of the middle class, the programs that in fact made the middle class in America, Social Security, Medicare, the housing finance programs, and to essentially divert part of the revenue stream from those programs to private benefit.
So who would be the predators?
Well, in the case of the housing finance sector, one could talk about the banks that took advantage and mortgage originators that took advantage of the political desupervision of that sector over the last 15 years to write massive amounts of essentially fraudulent mortgages and peddle them to the world investment community. That was a very predatory act which contributed massively to the financial crisis. In the case of the retirement programs, the effort to privatize Social Security, one can talk about the way in which the drug benefit in Medicare was initiated and administered that benefited the pharmaceutical companies far more than it should have. This is the kind of thing that I'm referring to.
So the subtitle of this book is How Conservatives Abandon the Free Market and Why Liberals Should Too. Let's start with the first half of that. How did conservatives and when did they abandon the free market in your view?
My public career started in the late 70s and especially in the early 1980s at the time of the Reagan administration, and I was the Democratic staff director of the Joint Economic Committee. And at that time, conservatives were true believers. They had a strong body of ideas which they defended very aggressively and imaginatively. And it was in fact quite a lot of fun to engage in that debate. And I made a lot of friends from that period whom I still have.
Such as?
And the late Jude Winniski became a friend of mine. Bruce Bartlett, who was my counterpart on the Joint Economic Committee, has been a good friend for 30 years. In the most recent Republican administration, I don't think there were any such avatars of big ideas. This was an administration that ran the country for the benefit of basically its own political constituencies. And it did so in a fairly unabashed way. But you couldn't engage in the same kind of arguments over ideas because there was essentially nobody on the other side who was upholding them.
So a Milton Friedman, even though you may disagree with him politically.
Yes, I mean, Milton Friedman was someone I debated, in fact, in 1990 when he reissued his television program, Free to Choose. I was on the first panel. He was I considered him to be a friend and someone whom you had to respect because he was advancing his ideas in in that format of debate that I very much admire.
So those are the types of ideas from the Milton Friedmans of the world, the F.A. Hayeks, which, in your view, the conservatives have abandoned, correct?
Yes. Oh, absolutely, sure. The conservatives abandoned Friedman very early. His ideas were, in fact, unworkable. I don't fault them for doing that, but they never advanced a coherent view of monetary policy that postdates Friedman.
And why liberals should, too, abandon the free markets. What does that mean?
The rhetoric of free markets is something that liberals have learned to give lip service to as a kind of price of admission to serious policy discussion in the United States. And that little barb would apply, for example, particularly to this administration, to the Obama administration. Back in the campaign in 2008, if you looked at candidate Barack Obama's website on economic policy, there was a paragraph there that was kind of an encomium to the glories of the free market. And my view is this is something which inhibits liberals and progressives from having a clear idea of what needs to be done now. It simply ties their hands behind their back and allows them to be beaten up by conservatives for not being true believers, when of course, in fact, for the most part, they're not.
So another well-known school of thought when it comes to economics, of course, is the Keynesian school of economics. Do you agree with the general principles of how that works?
I did my graduate studies in Cambridge, England, at King's College. I'm a member of King's College, which was Keynes's college. I identify quite closely. Keynes was one of the great imaginative figures of 20th century economics, and a person who really broke the mold in terms of thinking about how to deal with a cataclysmic event like the Great Depression. So it's impossible not to be drawn into that orbit if you read him in the context of his time. Do Keynesian economists as we see them today, have all the answers to our present problems? I think they don't, actually. I think we need a substantially more strategic approach. And in particular, Keynes's message has been vulgarized, it's been watered down, so that it becomes a question of us throwing money at the problem, priming the pump, spending aggressively, stimulating. I detest the term stimulus package. I think it was a public relations catastrophe and very bad choice of framing for an economic strategy. So I think we have to go far beyond that now. But still, it's better than the alternative.
So what do you mean far beyond that?
Speaking in very practical terms, we have to ask, what are our major problems? We have a huge problem of joblessness. Right? We have 14 million who are officially unemployed and another 10 or so who would come into the labor force if people were hiring. It's a vast problem. We have people who, the American middle class has been wiped out in its houses, largely because of the practice of fraudulent mortgages that were foisted on low-income people in the last decade. So we have a problem of foreclosures and a problem of essentially impoverishment. We have an energy problem. We have a climate problem. We have a decaying infrastructure. If you think about those issues, you recognize that we need to have a strategy that plays out over 10 or 15 or 20 years, sets a framework in which the private economy and the public sector can work together. And that's what I think we need, that goes beyond, as I say, both the conventional conservatives and the vulgar Keynesians.
But where does government spending fall in there? You mentioned that you don't like the term stimulus, and throwing money at a problem is not necessarily the solution.
Right.
So,
well, things will cost money. I don't think we should shy away from public spending, but we shouldn't pretend that we're going to put some money into the economy and everything will be all right in a couple of years. Businesses know when you do that in 2 years' time, when the public money is being withdrawn, their markets won't be there, so they won't come in and invest. You need to establish a framework that's going to carry us forward for a substantially longer period of time.
a fundamental restructuring of the U.S. economy?
Oh, sure. Oh, sure. I mean, the conditions that gave us the great boom of the 1950s through the 70s and 80s cannot be reproduced. We haven't just discovered the West Texas oil fields, for example. We have to operate in a very different world. We're not the dominant power that we were in 1945.
So where does, for example, the tech boom fall into your theory then? I mean, wouldn't that be like discovering the West Texas oil fields, in a sense?
We only wish. The tech boom is a very ambivalent event. It gave us a period of prosperity at the end of the 1990s and a tremendous period of enthusiasm and hope in which everybody shared. But we're now in what you might call the destructive phase of a creative destruction cycle. What we see is the effect of the adoption of these technologies on all kinds of industries, on newspapers, on book publishing, on retail sales, on finance. And it has two consequences. It makes some of these things much harder to control. The financial sector, I think, has been, its credibility is damaged by the ease with which you can slice and dice mortgages, for example, and sell them to the investment community. And it just reduces it cuts back on a great many jobs that were there before. And so you have to be thinking very actively about what kind of work people should have and how to create the institutions that give them that work.
Professor Galbraith, what about limiting executive salaries? Do you think that the government should have the right or the ability to limit how much executives make?
I'll take that in two parts.